Thank you very much, President Stelly, members of the jury. I was just going to give, for the benefit of the public, we obviously only go through this once every 10 years. And obviously most of the jury, this is the first time you're going through it. But even though you guys have learned some of this as we've been working on this, this kind of gives an orientation to what it is we have to do and why, and what are some of the requirements that we're going to follow. So the first thing is we're going to kind of go through what is redistricting, why we must redistrict, and a little bit of some of the requirements that we'll have to follow, state and federal laws that kind of cover what we have to do as part of this redistricting effort and what the timeline will be. The next thing we'll do is actually go over the numbers really quickly and kind of go over that. So redistricting is actually drawing the districting lines, and you have to correct for malapportionment when you get out of whack. The legislature has been redistricting and had its session back in February for a lot of the things that, you know, got a lot of attention in the media, you know, the legislature and the Congress and things like that. But a lot of redistricting occurs at the local level. The city councils and the police jury and the school boards all have to redistrict themselves prior to the election. The census occurs every 10 years. And so we did this, you know, 10 years ago, some of you remember, and it'll be every 10 years in the future. You're trying to equalize the population. The Constitution of the United States requires equal treatment of all persons, and the federal courts a number of years ago interpreted that to mean you had to have roughly equal districts. Our state law also gave some particular requirements and timelines that we'll have to follow. The legal issues that are kind of going to follow your process is a police jury in this state can consist of between 5 and 15 members, and as part of the redistricting process, the jury will select how many members it will have. You have to commence redistricting within 6 months of the official census release, which we did, and you have to adopt a malapportionment resolution, which we'll do tonight, which is one of the steps in the process. The next thing is we work off of precincts. A lot of people don't understand that, you know, you have to have the building blocks. The building blocks are the precincts as they currently exist. That's a typo that was carried forward from the last time we did this. I'll correct that for the next version. But there is a precinct freeze that's in effect from the year before the census until January of the year after. And so till January of 2023, you're not allowed to change the precinct boundaries, and you have to use the actual precinct, the precinct lines. The federal law is the one person, one vote, which is the substantially equal population standard. And generally that means a 10% rule. You can be, you target your ideal number, and then you can be within 5% plus or minus that for an overall deviation of 10% from population equality. The ideal population for a 15-member police jury with the parish's new population is that the target would be 14,452 people per district. You're allowed to deviate, like I said, within plus or minus 5% of that. The next thing is that you adhere to your traditional redistricting principles. The districts are as compact as you can make them, as contiguous as they have to be of contiguous territory. You prefer to maintain municipal boundaries where you can, meaning that you wouldn't divide a smaller community like DeQuincy or Vinton in half. You know, you would try to keep those communities of interest together. You would maintain the core of existing districts, stability of representation, which usually means don't redistrict people against each other, and then, of course, compliance with federal law like the Voting Rights Act. Those are the principles that the courts have always said you can rely upon and should rely upon when drawing your districts. The next thing, of course, is the Voting Rights Act. Last time we would have had to go through a process called pre-clearance. That's no longer required, but you still have to adhere to Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, which means that minority voters have to have a fair chance of electing their candidate of choice. And so in Calcasieu Parish, what that basically means is that there are 4 majority and minority districts, and federal law requires you to protect those 4 majority minority districts. Now, in protecting them, race cannot be the predominant factor or overriding factor. The courts have struck down unconstitutional racial gerrymanders that do not use traditional redistricting principles in drawing the lines. The classic example is this was Louisiana's old congressional district from the 1990s that the United States Supreme Court ultimately struck down. Now, that's not to say you couldn't draw one using traditional principles, but they found that that particular one did not adhere to that. So again, these are the principles that we'll try to follow as we work through this process. We have those requirements. Here's the timeline we're gonna follow after working with y'all's staff to try to figure out how it fits best within the requirements and fits best with y'all's meeting calendar. This is the first step tonight, which is to let the public see what y'all's initial draft is. And then that'll be up on the website and things like that. And the public will have an opportunity here over the next month to reach out to you guys either individually or to come back here for a public hearing and be heard. The public hearing is currently scheduled for June the 2nd, your regular meeting on June the 2nd. And there'll be an opportunity there for the public to be heard. And then on June the 23rd, at your regular meeting, you know, y'all can make amendments or consider any comments and potentially adopt the plan. The intention would be to adopt the plan that evening if there are enough votes and that's the will of the jury. So that's a little bit on the calendar. The parish had 216,780 people. I'll tell you, as someone who does this kind of work for every entity in the parish, I try to do a good job of keeping up with demographic trends so that we don't get surprised when the census comes around. Our model kind of takes in information based on school attendance and, you know, looks into some things like permits that were pulled in various jurisdictions and things like that. We were actually trending a little bit higher than that. You know, my personal opinion is that but for the hurricane, we would have been a little bit higher than that. Because the census response period did overlap where the in-person visits would have been overlapping with the hurricane. Now, unfortunately, we all know people who left and, you know, so potentially then that went back down after that. But officially, census 216,780 people, which was growth in the parish of right at 12.5%. The ideal district population is 14,452 people. And you're trying to be within plus or minus 5%, which is 13,730, all the way up to 15,174. So that's the range from which you can work and get the districts. So this is what we call the Malapportionment map, and it's here behind me as well as being on the screen if it's easier to see over here. Districts 3 and 4 were the most down at roughly 10–11% down. And those are districts kind of in the northern part of Lake Charles. Districts 7, 8, 9, and 10 all had pretty substantive swings on the upside. And so those would be districts in basically the southern corridor of Lake Charles. And that's both African American and white, southwest and southeast, but pretty consistent growth along the entire southern corridor of Lake Charles, as well as in, you know, District 10 is Mr. Stelly's district, growth in the LeBlue settlement area and up in the Gillis area. Everything is you know, you got to require the puzzle pieces to fit together. And so ultimately, whatever you come up with, you have to come up with something that, you know, shifts around and makes it all work. So after, you know, a lot of discussion with some of you individually and then, you know, kind of collective looks, we've come up with an initial proposal to put out for the public. Obviously, it can be subject to amendment as we go through the process, change, et cetera. There'll be opportunities for that as we go through before we land on the final project. But this is the proposal that y'all are putting out for the public. Basically, what you see is you equalize all the districts. And again, I'll do it here in case it's a little easier to see. You equalize all the districts to get within the plus or minus 5%. And effectively, to do that, you have to move one of the districts from one of the districts west of the river has to go east of the river and pick up a Moss Bluff precinct. That's for two reasons. One, the districts over there collectively needed people, and two, Ward 1 needed to shed some people. And so that kind of is the first building block. And then you kind of start working in Lake Charles, and in Lake Charles you kind of have to have this counterclockwise shift to get the population from the southern corridor up. And so, as we can continue to make any changes that the public or you guys can suggest, this was kind of a starting point based on the feedback and the analysis that we had worked through. This is a blow-up version of the same thing, which is what we call the Metro map. The Metro map is a kind of a zoomed-in version, kind of on the Lake Charles Sulphur corridor, where it's a little easier to see things on the more dense streets in the middle of town. And so, with that, we will. That concludes the presentation. The resolution you have is not to adopt the plan. It's not even to introduce the plan. The resolution that you have for tonight is just to recognize the malapportionment, which is a step required by the statute. Recognize that we're out of compliance with the plus or minus 5%, and then we'll proceed over the next meetings to come up with the final resolution, or actually be an ordinance that adopts the map and fixes that. The last thing I'll say, because this question usually comes up, when does this go into effect? This goes into effect for the 2023 elections, so next fall's elections. You would use this to run next fall, and then it would be the districts that whomever is elected next fall represent starting January 1 of 24. So you still represent your current districts and your current territory through the end of your term, and new districts will be used in the elections in the fall of 23, and then will be applicable to whomever might be elected starting January 1, 24.